Welcome to another one of your flipped lectures. Today we're going to talk about urbanization and the development of the American city. One of the effects of industrialization, the changes in the American economy, is a mass migration from rural America to urban America. When we talk about rural America, we're talking about places that are mostly farmland, not really kind of big urban cities. But cities in the 30 years between 1870 and 1900 are going to grow from 10 million cities to 30 million cities. New York is going to grow from 800,000 to 3.5 million. Chicago going to grow from 109,000 to 1.6 million. So this gives you an idea of kind of the scale of how many people are really kind of moving to the cities during this time. And there's a number of reasons why the city began to become the center of American life. The first is immigration. A lot of the immigrants that are going to arrive are going to kind of migrate towards those cities because usually there's a community, kind of immigrants already there. That's a pull factor. Also kind of jobs in the cities, cheap, affordable rents. So immigration is going to kind of make up a lot of the population of the city. Also, industrialization concentrates jobs in urban areas, and as we talked about before, kind of people are going to go where there are jobs. Also, farmers. A lot of people are going to abandon their farms because the cities can simply offer higher paying, better jobs, and also the city kind of offers a lot of utilities, right? The electric lights, modern plumbing, running water. Also, things like libraries, public services, theaters, entertainment. And so there's a lot of pulls for people to kind of leave rural life or immigrants to kind of migrate to the American city. And the cities are going to kind of take on their distinctive form during this time. There's going to be new styles of architecture. They're going to kind of make each city unique. The skyscraper is going to become kind of a mainstay of urban life. Again, steel, allowing for skyscrapers to be built. Also things like large residential buildings, tenements, apartment buildings. Also like larger churches, libraries, theaters. Kind of as these populations grow, kind of the scale of everything has to kind of keep up with it. Also, cities are going to have to develop public transportation in order to help people kind of get around the city in a more orderly fashion. In the city, there's also going to be class separation. Kind of the rich and poor are going to kind of be separated out, and that's going to be another characteristic of kind of the city. And problems of the cities are kind of the same as today. Crime, disease, pollution, fire. Kind of all of these problems that arise when you put a large group of people in a small area are going to kind of develop in these cities. And we talk about like class separations. It's something that to a certain extent we can kind of still see today in cities. But in Chicago in kind of the late 1800s, early 1900s, there were neighborhoods like Bridgeport and back of the yards that were really considered to be slums. You kind of see a picture of that like on the left. And these tenements, the things that kind of you read about in Maggie Girl, The Streets. And at the same time, down by kind of Lakeshore Drive and the North Shore, you also have huge mansions, kind of the Potter Palmer House, which is it was a castle that was built by kind of a wealthy Chicago merchant during this time. So we talk about kind of class separation in the cities. Kind of we can see that this is something that we still have today, but it really develops kind of during this time. Also, kind of different architecture is going to kind of start to take its shape. Here's the Chicago building. It's downtown, kind of a Michigan Avenue, and you can still kind of go down, Madison, and you can still go down and see kind of some of this architecture. It's actually very, very old, but kind of unique architectural styles begin to be developed. And when we talk about the history of urbanization, we can even kind of just look at a little bit of kind of the history of Chicago. This is kind of what someone imagined a bird's eye view would look like in kind of the 1880s. And if we kind of look at kind of the houses from this time, we can kind of see kind of the brownstone houses that kind of dominate our neighborhoods today. These are actually being built in kind of the 1880s into kind of the 20th century as well. And so kind of Chicago as we know it today begins to take its form during this time. And a lot of the reason that Chicago is going to be the way it is because of the Great Chicago Fire that happened in 1871. At this time, Chicago had been growing very, very rapidly, and a lot of the buildings were actually just made of wood, because wood was a very cheap, kind of quick building material. However, kind of the fire that started in Mrs. O'Leary's barn soon spread to engulf large parts of the city, to the point where kind of large parts of Chicago are going to be destroyed during this time. And so Kind of a notable exception, though, is, of course, the water tower. If we go downtown, we can see kind of the water tower is still there. But whenever something is destroyed, there is always a chance for renewal and rebirth. And for Chicago, an architect named Daniel Burnham, along with a few others, came up with a plan for Chicago to rebuild it, to create a modern metropolis that would serve all Chicagoans. He was famous for saying, "Make no little plans, for they have little to inspire the hearts of men." And the plan of Chicago certainly made no little plans. Their goals were to improve the lakefront. The fear was that everybody would build right up to the lakefront and it would be kind of destroyed. Also developing a highway system to incorporate the suburbs into the city and to make the city the center of economic life. Improving the freight and passenger railway systems, kind of with steel, and building kind of that public transportation system. Also acquiring park systems. Industrialization had created fear that maybe kind of nothing natural, nature, would be preserved. And so basically they wanted to create a Chicago with parks. So they planned out the parks. Also arranging systematic streets so that our Chicago basically runs on a grid and you can navigate it very easily. And then also kind of the idea of just creating Chicago as a civic center of kind of culture and government kind of in downtown Chicago. And though all the plan of Chicago didn't really happen, a lot of it did, and that's the reason that the city kind of looks the way it is today. And Chicago, shortly after the fire, wanted to showcase itself as a world modern city, and they got a chance when they hosted the World's Fair, the Columbian Exposition of 1893. And in 1893, Chicago showcased itself to the world as a modern city. It was called the White City, in part because a lot of the buildings for the World's Fair were built out of marble. The first Ferris wheel was put into Chicago, and it's actually the one that kind of we have today, right? Kind of the idea of the Ferris wheel. And at night, modern electricity lit up the White City. And so Chicago kind of very rapidly, it's a good kind of look at Chicago as an example of how kind of quickly modern urbanization is going to take place. From kind of 1870 to 1900, Chicago almost reinvents itself as a modern city. And today we can kind of still see this legacy. The museum campus, kind of down by Soldier Field, down by the lake, is the remnants of the White City that was built for the 1893 World's Fair. And if you look at the lakefront today and the streets, you can see that kind of the planning out of the urban areas is really going to create modern Chicago as we know it today. But it was this idea of kind of the city becoming the center of life and the need to organize large groups of people that creates the modern cities in which we live today. And so ultimately, what was the impact of urbanization? The impact of this rapid move from rural to urban is that 80% of Americans currently live in cities. Also, city problems and city values are going to come to dominate state and national politics on every level. And also cities became, and they remain today, the economic and cultural centers of the country, where kind of the business of Chicago is much more important to the economy of the country than the economics of kind of the more country, southern Illinois. Also, those ethnic neighborhoods, they still remain today. We still call them kind of by their names, right? Ukrainian Village, right? Chinatown. And so the impact of urbanization is that in a very short period of time, it completely remakes American life and centers it on these large urban centers, as opposed to a kind of more spread out rural America in which the majority of people lived on farms and owned land. And so kind of along with urbanization, American culture itself is going to change kind of in this age. And this age we're talking about is called the Gilded Age, and we'll talk about a little bit why later. But American culture is going to develop surrounding industrialization, urbanization, and immigration. And one of the big kind of movers in American culture was an idea called individualism. And individualism is a value that is still considered to be kind of very American today. And it's the belief that no matter a person's origins, no matter kind of where they come from or their circumstances, that they can rise as far as talent and hard work can take them. And this is kind of the American ideal of opportunity, the land of opportunity. And the phrase rags to riches gets coined by Horatio Alger, who writes a series of novels about people who go from humble beginnings and work their way up to become millionaires. And so this idea of kind of change in the economy led a lot of people to kind of believe that there was more opportunity than there had ever been, and that anybody could really go from rags to riches because industrialization had created so much new opportunity. Now, that wasn't always the case. There's going to be another literary movement that is going to basically criticize individualism, but this is a value that kind of gets refined during this time, but then also it is currently a very popular idea in our present day as well. There's also another idea that goes a little bit with individualism, but it takes it a bit further. And it's the idea of social Darwinism. The idea that survival of the fittest, kind of open competition between people, between animals and nature, which is kind of the theory of Darwinism, can also be applied to basically society, the way that people work. And social Darwinism says that basically people are successful because they are more fit for survival, and that people who fail because they are less fit. A lot of business leaders who basically credited themselves with their success, and perhaps rightfully so, they accepted this notion. However, it became controversial because reformers will say that in reality, circumstances, not just kind of the nature of the individual, are really going to have a big effect on success and failure. So again, social Darwinism kind of takes individualism a step further to say that those who are successful because they are more fit and perhaps better, and that circumstances don't determine your fate as much as basically kind of your nature. However, there were plenty of critics of individualism, and especially plenty of critics of social Darwinism. The author Mark Twain called this time the Gilded Age, saying that the age was gilded. Gilded means something that was golden on the outside, but actually on the inside was only just kind of iron or something regular. And so Mark Twain said, while this era had the appearance of kind of great wealth and great prosperity, in reality, the underside of poverty, the underside of all the social problems of kind of the slums, of poverty, of crime, of pollution, were not really addressed. Also, Henry George wrote a book called Progress in Poverty, in which he tried to explain how America could have so much wealth and also so much poverty simultaneously. People looked at child labor and sought for the expansion of public schools to give more Americans an opportunity kind of in the future. There's also a literary movement called naturalism that emphasized that circumstances can destroy somebody's lives through no fault of their own. A really great example of kind of naturalism is the book Maggie Girl of the Streets, one that you guys have all read. In that kind of Maggie really kind of her life gets destroyed, not because she herself is a bad person, but because her circumstances continue to kind of harm her. And then finally, kind of the start of a lot of charity and social organizations aimed at starting poverty kind of begin during this time. Some of these organizations are still around today, like the Salvation Army and the YMCA. And also Jane Addams and other social reformers would start settlement houses like Hull House in Chicago in order to try to give the poor kind of lodging, education, and kind of more opportunity. And so during this time, Americans had to struggle with kind of what they thought about all of kind of this new, kind of all this change about industrialization, urbanization, the problems of cities. And so Americans fought, just like today, about what that meant and about how the country needed to react to the changes that occurred. One change that's kind of fun to talk about, however, is that the new economy, the industrialized economy, changes our relationship as Americans to our entertainment. Urbanization, the idea of kind of big cities, creates the idea that there needs to be activities for people to do at their leisure. Also, the idea of going to work and going home means that you now have kind of some free time. And so you have to figure out what you are going to spend your free time and your free money on. In this time, baseball and other professional sports actually become very, very popular. Collegiate football becomes a very popular pastime in certain communities, and again, kind of baseball. The first version of the Chicago Cubs starts playing at the first version of Wrigley Field kind of during this era. Also, amusement parks like Coney Island in New York are created to kind of give people somewhere to go. Going to the beach or riding the Ferris wheel or a roller coaster, or even just grabbing a hot dog and a soft drink at Nathan's become kind of a mainstay of American life. In that, our entertainment comes to, in a lot of ways, define us. Also, vaudeville theater, kind of before kind of movie theaters get created, kind of vaudeville theater shows are going to be kind of a very popular form of entertainment. And so, kind of with all the changes of this time, not only is the way that Americans work and live going to change, also how they spend their free time and how they're entertained is going to change as well.